Camp Barkley, Texas, November 1943. The infirmary smelled of iodine and sweat, sharp against the cool autumn air seeping through cracked windows. Lieutenant Margaret Fisher stood over a dying German prisoner, watching blood pool beneath the surgical table where regulations said her work should end. His pulse weakened beneath her fingers. The camp commander's orders were explicit: emergency stabilization only, no extraordinary measures for enemy combatants. Outside, the Texas wind carried dust across empty plains. Inside, she made a choice that would force the U.S. Army to confront a question it had been avoiding: how much humanity do we owe our enemies? The prisoner of war camp at Abilene, Texas stretched across 40 acres of flatland, where mesquite trees broke the horizon like scattered sentinels. By late 1943, Camp Barkley housed over 3,000 German prisoners, most captured in North Africa after Rommel's defeats at El Alamein and Tunisia. They arrived expecting brutality. They found a hospital staffed by American nurses who treated bullet wounds with the same precision they used for American soldiers. Margaret Fisher had been an Army nurse for 2 years, 27 years old, from Philadelphia, trained at Pennsylvania Hospital before the war consumed everything. She had tended Americans torn apart at Kasserine Pass, sewn together boys from Kansas and Georgia, who screamed for their mothers while morphine dulled their agony. When the Army assigned her to Camp Barkley's POW medical unit in August 1943, she expected her skills would rust. Prisoners received minimal care, she'd been told. Enough to keep them alive, not enough to waste resources. She discovered something different. The camp infirmary operated under Geneva Convention requirements, which mandated that prisoners receive medical treatment equivalent to a nation's own forces. But equivalence was a slippery concept. Did it mean the same urgency, the same supplies, the same emotional investment from nurses who had brothers fighting overseas, who read casualty lists every morning, who knew these German soldiers had killed Americans? The answer varied by nurse, by day, by patient. Sergeant Hans Becker arrived at Camp Barkley in September 1943, part of a transport from the Afrika Korps. 24 years old, from Hamburg, he'd spent 18 months in the desert before British forces captured him near Tunis. The journey to Texas took 6 weeks, across the Mediterranean by ship, through processing camps in Virginia, then by rail across American vastness that stunned him silent. Germany's forests were dense and close. Texas was exposure itself, sky pressing down like judgment. He'd been wounded twice before, shrapnel in Tunisia, burns in Libya, but those injuries had been treated by German medics in field conditions. When dysentery swept through his barracks at Camp Barkley in late October, reducing strong men to hollow-eyed wraiths who couldn't stand without assistance, he experienced American medicine for the first time. Nurse Helen Kowalski checked him into the infirmary. Polish-American from Chicago. Her parents had fled Europe in 1920. She spoke broken German from childhood, enough to ask him questions. Where does it hurt? How long? Can you keep water down? Her touch was clinical but not cruel. She started an IV without hesitation, regulated fluids, monitored his fever through 3 days while his body fought infection. Becker would later write in a letter smuggled to his family through the Red Cross: "The American nurses show no hatred. This confuses us more than cruelty would." That confusion was strategic, though few at Camp Barkley understood it yet. The U.S. military had learned from World War I's failures. Brutal treatment of German prisoners had backfired, hardening enemy resolve, creating martyrs for propaganda. This time, the approach was different. Calculated humanity designed to erode Nazi ideology from within. Treat them well, feed them American abundance, show them democracy's material success, and they might question everything they'd been told. But somewhere between strategy and execution, something unplanned occurred. The nurses began to care. Not romantically, not politically, but medically, the way nurses care for anyone in pain. Margaret Fisher would describe it years later in an interview. "You can't watch someone suffer and remain indifferent. The moment they're your patient, something shifts. They're not the enemy anymore. They're the 17-year-old boy from Stuttgart who needs his appendix removed before sepsis kills him." Lieutenant Colonel William Sterling commanded Camp Barkley's medical operations. West Point graduate, career officer, he believed in regulations the way other men believed in scripture. The Geneva Conventions were clear. Medical care for POWs was mandatory, but should not exceed what was militarily necessary. Emergency procedures, yes. Elective surgeries, no. Blood transfusions only in extreme cases. Experimental treatments, absolutely forbidden. His nurses followed these rules precisely until November 18, 1943. The evening shift began at 1800 hours. Nurse Fisher drew infirmary duty, alongside Corporal Rita Santos, a 22-year-old from San Antonio who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. 16 prisoners occupied the ward, pneumonia cases mostly, 2 with infected wounds, 1 recovering from appendectomy. Routine work. Charts, temperatures, medications distributed from locked cabinets, paperwork completed in triplicate. At 1945 hours, guards brought in Corporal Ernst Zimmerman. He'd been working the camp motor pool, repairing a transport truck when the jack failed. The vehicle's rear axle crushed his leg. Compound fracture, femur snapped clean through, bone fragments visible beneath torn flesh. He was unconscious when they carried him in, pale as death, bleeding faster than Fisher had seen since North Africa. She assessed him in seconds. Critical condition, massive blood loss, shock setting in. Without immediate surgery and transfusion, he'd be dead in 30 minutes. Santos was already setting up the surgical table, hands moving with practiced efficiency. Fisher reached for the camp phone to call Colonel Sterling. Protocol required command authorization for major procedures on POWs. The line was dead. November storms had taken down telephone wires across Abilene. The backup communication system, a runner to headquarters, would take 20 minutes minimum. Zimmerman didn't have 20 minutes. Fisher stood at the threshold of decision. Army regulations were explicit. Emergency stabilization only. Let the prisoner die rather than exceed authority. The logic was clean. Resources were limited. Every pint of American blood used for a German was one less for U.S. soldiers, and dead enemies couldn't kill Americans later. But medical ethics were older than regulations. The Hippocratic Oath didn't include clauses about nationality. Fisher had sworn to preserve life. Zimmerman's life was bleeding out onto her surgical table. She made eye contact with Santos. "Prep for surgery, full procedure. I'll take responsibility." Santos nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." They worked in near silence, moving through routines learned under fire. Fisher administered anesthesia while Santos scrubbed surgical instruments. The infirmary's other nurse, Lieutenant Jane Holloway, arrived from the supply room with blood plasma. They'd used it before for American soldiers, never for prisoners. She set it beside the table without speaking. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Fisher set the femur with plates salvaged from medical supplies, cleaned the wound of debris and damaged tissue, sutured blood vessels torn by bone fragments. Santos maintained anesthesia, monitored vitals, called out blood pressure readings that slowly stabilized. Holloway administered 3 units of plasma, then switched to whole blood when plasma proved insufficient. American blood, type O negative universal donor, drawn from soldiers at the base hospital and stored for emergencies. Each unit was labeled, tracked, inventoried. Using it for a German prisoner would require documentation, explanation, justification that Fisher couldn't provide. She used it anyway. By midnight, Zimmerman's pulse was steady, weak but regular. His breathing normalized. The compound fracture was set, stabilized, wrapped in clean bandages. He'd need weeks of recovery, possible additional surgeries, extensive physical rehabilitation. But he would live. Fisher stripped off her surgical gloves and washed blood from her hands. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. Through the infirmary windows, Texas stars blazed in a sky so vast it swallowed fear. She'd saved a man's life tonight. The U.S. Army would call it insubordination. Colonel Sterling arrived at the infirmary at 700 hours the next morning. The telephone lines had been restored overnight. Someone had informed him. He stood beside Zimmerman's bed, reviewing the surgical notes Fisher had prepared. His face revealed nothing. In the harsh fluorescent light, he looked older than his 43 years, weathered by decisions that turned men into statistics. "Lieutenant Fisher," he said quietly, My office. Now. She followed him across the compound, past barracks where German prisoners lined up for morning roll call, past the mess hall where American guards joked over coffee. The morning was cold, unseasonably so, and her breath formed clouds that dissipated in sunlight just beginning to warm the Texas plains. Sterling's office smelled of paper and stale cigarettes. He gestured to a chair. She remained standing. You performed major surgery on a prisoner without authorization, Sterling began. You used American blood supplies. You exceeded your authority under both military regulations and camp protocols. Do you dispute any of these facts? No, sir. Why? Fisher met his eyes. He was dying. I'm a nurse. I saved him. Sterling lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly. That's not an answer, Lieutenant. You're a military nurse. You follow orders. Those orders were explicit, emergency stabilization only. You chose to interpret that broadly. I interpreted it medically, sir. The medical interpretation is mine to make, not yours. Silence filled the space between them. Outside, someone shouted commands. Boots on gravel. The ordinary sounds of a military camp that operated according to rules designed to prevent exactly this kind of individual judgment. Sterling stubbed out his cigarette. The problem, Lieutenant, is that your interpretation was correct. Fisher blinked. Sir? Geneva Conventions, Article 15. Medical treatment for prisoners must be equivalent to that provided for a nation's own forces. If an American soldier had suffered the same injury, we would have performed surgery immediately. Denying it to Zimmerman would have been a war crime. He paused. But that doesn't excuse your failure to seek authorization. The phones were down, sir. You could have waited. He would have died. Yes. Sterling stood, walked to the window overlooking the camp. That's the contradiction we're navigating. Follow regulations, violate international law. Violate regulations, uphold international law. There's no clean answer. He turned back to face her. I'm recommending you for commendation, and I'm confining you to quarters for 3 days for insubordination. Both actions will appear in your record. Your career will survive this, but barely. Fisher felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition that she'd been prepared for worse. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Lieutenant. What you did will have consequences beyond your career. He was right. Word of Zimmerman's surgery spread through Camp Barkley like smoke. By afternoon, every German prisoner knew an American nurse had saved one of their own. By evening, the story had reached other POW camps through the grapevine of transferred prisoners and guard gossip. By week's end, it appeared in Red Cross reports monitored by both Allied and Axis intelligence. The German prisoners' response was immediate and unexpected. 3 days after the surgery, a delegation of senior German NCOs requested a meeting with Colonel Sterling. They stood in his office at attention, led by Feldwebel Otto Kessler, a career soldier captured at Kasserine Pass who served as the prisoner's spokesman. We wish to thank the American nurses, Kessler said in careful English. For Zimmerman, for all of us, we did not expect such treatment. Sterling studied them. You're prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions require proper medical care. With respect, Colonel, we have been prisoners in British camps before coming here. We know the difference between requirement and kindness. Kessler paused. We wish to do something in return. That's not necessary. It is necessary for us, sir. What followed was unprecedented. The German prisoners organized a fundraiser, selling handmade crafts to guards and local civilians, pooling their minimal wages from camp work details to purchase gifts for the nursing staff. They carved wooden figurines, braided leather keychains, fashioned jewelry from bits of metal salvaged from workshops. Every item bore meticulous craftsmanship, the kind of attention to detail that speaks of gratitude too large for words. On December 15, 1943, they presented these gifts to the nurses during a ceremony in the camp chapel. Lieutenant Fisher received a hand-carved music box depicting Abilene's landscape. Inside, a mechanism played Silent Night, in delicate notes that filled the chapel with sound that transcended language. Nurse Santos cried, Holloway accepted her gift, a leather-bound notebook with hands that trembled. The German prisoners stood in formation, faces carefully neutral. But something had shifted in the camp's atmosphere. The weight of enmity had lifted slightly, not disappeared but become less crushing. Ernst Zimmermann attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, his leg still healing. He shook Fischer's hand and said in broken English, "You give me life, I not forget." The moment was photographed by an Army public affairs officer. The image would later cause controversy. American nurses accepting gifts from Nazi soldiers, smiling alongside men who had killed Allied troops. But in that chapel, on that December afternoon, ideology felt distant. What mattered was the human transaction between healer and healed. Yet not everyone celebrated this development. Major Harrison Webb arrived at Camp Barkley in January 1944. Inspector General's office, sent to investigate irregularities in POW medical treatment protocols. He was 47, lawyers before the war, a man who believed regulations existed for reasons that transcended individual circumstances. He interviewed Colonel Sterling first, then every nurse who'd worked the infirmary, then select German prisoners, including Zimmermann. His questions were precise, his manner coldly professional. He took extensive notes, cross-referenced testimonies, examined supply records to document every unit of blood plasma used for POW treatment. His investigation focused on a disturbing pattern. Camp Barkley's nurses had provided German prisoners with medical care that, in Webb's assessment, exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Not just Zimmermann's surgery, dozens of smaller decisions that collectively represented what he termed excessive medical fraternization. Blood transfusions for non-life-threatening conditions, extended rehabilitation for injuries that could heal with minimal intervention. Painkillers distributed more generously than regulations specified. Emotional support, nurses sitting with dying prisoners, writing letters to their families, providing comfort beyond clinical necessity. Webb's preliminary report was damning. The medical staff at Camp Barkley has lost sight of their primary duty to American forces. Their treatment of enemy prisoners, while ostensibly humanitarian, represents a dangerous blurring of appropriate boundaries. It is recommended that key personnel be reassigned and protocols be tightened to prevent similar fraternization at other facilities. Lieutenant Fischer read portions of the report in Sterling's office. Her hands remained steady, but something cold settled in her stomach. "He's recommending my transfer," she said. Sterling nodded. "Yours and 3 others. He believes you've become emotionally compromised." "We've become competent medical professionals, sir. There's a difference." Not to Webb, and unfortunately he has support from higher command. There's concern that POW camps are becoming too comfortable, that we're treating the enemy better than military necessity requires. Fischer set down the report. "What happens to Zimmermann if I'm transferred? He needs ongoing care for months. Another nurse will manage his treatment. Will they care whether he walks again or just ensure he doesn't die?" Sterling had no answer. The investigation crystallized a fundamental tension in American POW policy. Military efficiency demanded minimal investment in enemy prisoners. International law required humane treatment. But humanity itself, the actual emotional labor of caring for the suffering, existed in a gray zone that regulations couldn't adequately address. Webb's investigation ultimately reached the War Department in Washington, where it landed on desks of officials navigating impossible contradictions. They wanted German prisoners treated well enough to avoid retaliation against American POWs in German camps, but not so well that American citizens questioned why enemy soldiers received better medical care than some civilian hospitals could provide during wartime rationing. The compromise they reached satisfied no one. March 1944. Major Webb's final report arrived at Camp Barkley with recommendations and directives that would reshape POW medical care across all American camps. The verdict was complex. Lieutenant Margaret Fischer would not be transferred. Her actions, while technically insubordinate, were deemed medically justified under Geneva Convention requirements. However, she would receive an official reprimand in her service record and mandatory retraining on POW medical protocols. All nurses at POW camps would undergo new training, emphasizing appropriate professional distance from enemy prisoners. Medical care would continue to meet Geneva standards, but emotional support would be minimized. Nurses were instructed to view themselves as technicians rather than caregivers. Perform the procedure, don't invest in the outcome. Blood supplies for POW use would be more strictly monitored. Life-threatening situations only. Each transfusion required written justification submitted to command within 24 hours. The gifts from German prisoners to nursing staff would be confiscated and destroyed. Such exchanges constituted fraternization that undermined military discipline. Colonel Sterling read these directives to his assembled medical staff in the camp conference room. The Texas sun streamed through windows, illuminating dust particles that hung in the air like suspended judgment. "These are your new orders," he concluded. "You will follow them precisely, no exceptions." Nurse Santos raised her hand. "Sir, what about Zimmerman? His rehabilitation requires months of physical therapy." "Physical therapy will continue as medically necessary, but the personal attention he's received, conversations, encouragement, emotional support, that ends now." Holloway spoke quietly. "You're asking us to treat them like machines being repaired. I'm asking you to remember they're the enemy, Lieutenant, and that our primary duty is to American forces." Fisher said nothing. But that evening, she visited Zimmerman in the infirmary. He was progressing well, walking short distances with crutches, his leg healing cleanly. She checked his vitals, examined his surgical site, recorded observations in his chart with clinical precision. As she prepared to leave, Zimmerman spoke. "You are troubled, yes?" She shouldn't have answered. The new protocols forbade personal conversations, but something in his expression, concern, genuine human concern for her well-being, broke through her professional distance. "The Army believes we've been too kind to you," she said. Zimmerman absorbed this. "In Germany, we were taught Americans were weak because of kindness, that your softness would lose the war." He paused. "But I think your kindness is strength we did not understand." Fisher left without responding, but his words stayed with her. The new protocols transformed Camp Barclay's infirmary. Medical care continued at the same technical level. Nurses still performed surgeries, administered medications, treated injuries and illnesses with professional competence. But the atmosphere changed. No more conversations beyond medical necessity. No more sitting with patients through difficult nights. No more letters written on behalf of prisoners to their families. The human warmth that had characterized the infirmary disappeared, replaced by efficient coldness that met regulations but felt like betrayal. The German prisoners noticed immediately. Within weeks, subtle changes rippled through the camp. Prisoners became less cooperative during medical examinations. Some refused treatment for minor ailments. Others complied mechanically, but without the previous willingness to engage with nursing staff. The tentative trust that had been building dissolved. Feldwebel Kessler requested another meeting with Colonel Sterling. This time his tone was formal, distant. "We understand the new situation," Kessler said. "We are prisoners. We should not have expected more than survival. But I must tell you, something important was lost. We had begun to believe American propaganda about democracy and human dignity. Now we wonder if that was the lie." Sterling had no response that didn't sound hollow. The psychological impact on the nursing staff was equally profound. Lieutenant Fisher found herself struggling with directives that felt morally wrong, even as they were legally defensible. She was a nurse because she believed in healing, not just bodies, but the full human being. Reducing patients to medical problems that needed solving felt like mutilation of her professional calling. Nurse Santos requested transfer to a combat hospital in Europe. "I joined to help people," she explained to Fisher. "Here, I'm just following orders." Holloway became withdrawn, performing her duties with mechanical precision, but losing the spark that made her exceptional. She described this period years later. "We became what we were afraid the enemy was, cold, efficient, inhuman. The gifts that had been confiscated were never destroyed, despite the directive. Colonel Sterling quietly stored them in his personal quarters, unwilling to eliminate physical evidence of the humanity that had briefly transcended war. He never told Webb this omission. Ernst Zimmermann completed his rehabilitation in May 1944. His leg healed with minimal permanent damage. He walked with a slight limp but regained full function. Medically, Fischer's surgery had been a complete success. But their final interaction was brief, professional, devoid of the warmth that had characterized his recovery's early stages. "Thank you for your medical care, Lieutenant," he said formally. "You're welcome, Corporal," she replied. Neither mentioned what had been lost. While Camp Barkley navigated these tensions, the war continued its grinding progression. By spring 1944, Allied forces were preparing for the Normandy invasion that would finally open a Western front in Europe. More German prisoners arrived at camps across America, soldiers captured in Italy, North Africa, and eventually from the D-Day battles themselves. The question of how to treat these prisoners became increasingly urgent as their numbers swelled. By mid-1944, over 370,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States. Each represented a daily calculation of resources, security, and humanitarian obligations. The debate reached Congress. Senator James Murray of Montana questioned whether American taxpayers should fund comfortable accommodations for enemy soldiers, while American families endured rationing. Representative Claire Booth Luce countered that Geneva Convention compliance protected American POWs in German camps from retaliation. Behind these political arguments, the human reality was more complex. German prisoners in American camps were dying at rates far lower than Allied prisoners in German camps. Not because of deliberate cruelty in Germany, but because of resource scarcity and deteriorating conditions as the Nazi state collapsed. American abundance meant even minimal care for POWs exceeded what Germany could provide. This disparity created moral paradoxes. German prisoners in Texas ate better than German civilians in Hamburg. They received medical care superior to what many rural Americans could access. They lived in relative safety while their countrymen died by thousands in Allied bombing raids. Lieutenant Fischer understood these paradoxes intellectually, but in the infirmary, they felt irrelevant. The man bleeding on her surgical table wasn't an abstraction. He was immediate, physical, dying. Her medical training demanded response regardless of geopolitics. Yet Major Webb's investigation had made clear that individual conscience couldn't override institutional requirements. The military was not a democracy where nurses voted on appropriate care levels. It was a hierarchy where orders flowed downward and obedience was mandatory. Fischer struggled with this tension throughout spring 1944. She followed the new protocols precisely, maintained professional distance, documented every decision in triplicate, but something essential had been severed: the connection between her medical skill and her sense of moral purpose. In April, she wrote a letter to her sister in Philadelphia. "I'm still a nurse, I still save lives, but I feel like a technician now, not a healer. Maybe that's what war requires, the ability to separate technique from compassion, to perform without caring. But it's killing something inside me that I'm not sure I'll recover when this ends." She never sent the letter. Instead, she burned it in the infirmary's incinerator, watching paper curl and blacken, transforming words into ash that dispersed into Texas sky. June 1944. Ernst Zimmermann was transferred from Camp Barkley to a labor camp in Michigan, where German prisoners worked in agriculture to offset American labor shortages. The transfer was routine. Prisoners were regularly relocated based on security classifications and work assignments. But 3 weeks after his arrival, Zimmermann collapsed during fieldwork. The camp physician diagnosed acute appendicitis requiring immediate surgery. The operation was performed at a civilian hospital in Grand Rapids, where surgical teams had minimal experience with POW cases. Complications developed post-surgery. Infections set in, resistant to initial antibiotic treatments. Zimmermann's condition deteriorated rapidly, and the Michigan camp's medical staff, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of D-Day wounded requiring stateside recovery, struggled to provide adequate care. A Red Cross inspector visiting the camp noted Zimmerman's condition in a routine report. That report eventually reached Camp Barkley through administrative channels. Colonel Sterling read it in his morning briefing and immediately contacted Lieutenant Fisher. "Zimmerman's dying in Michigan," Sterling said without preamble. "Sepsis from appendectomy complications. They're not equipped to handle it." Fisher felt something tighten in her chest. "What do you need from me, sir?" "Nothing. I'm not authorized to request his transfer back here. I'm telling you because I thought you'd want to know." After Sterling dismissed her, Fisher spent 2 hours alone in the infirmary, reviewing Zimmerman's original surgical notes. She'd done everything correctly: textbook procedure, clean execution, appropriate follow-up. His leg had healed perfectly, but that success had enabled his transfer to a camp where inferior medical care was now killing him. She made a decision she couldn't justify militarily. That evening, Fisher wrote a detailed medical report documenting Zimmerman's case history, his successful recovery at Camp Barkley, and the specific complications he'd developed in Michigan. She included precise recommendations for treatment: antibiotic combinations, surgical interventions, supportive care protocols that only someone intimately familiar with his medical history could provide. She sent this report directly to the Michigan camp, bypassing official channels. It was arguably another act of insubordination. Nurses weren't authorized to provide medical guidance to other facilities without command approval. But she was also the only person who fully understood Zimmerman's physiological responses to treatment. Her intimate knowledge of his case made her recommendations uniquely valuable. The Michigan physicians followed her protocols. Within 72 hours, Zimmerman's condition stabilized. Within 2 weeks, the infection cleared. By July, he was back to full health. Colonel Sterling learned about Fisher's report 3 weeks after she'd sent it, when the Michigan camp physician wrote to thank Camp Barkley for the excellent medical consultation that saved a prisoner's life. He called Fisher to his office. She expected reprimand. Instead, Sterling handed her the thank you letter. "You did it again," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." "I should discipline you." "Yes, sir." Sterling was silent for a long moment. Then, "The Army has 2 kinds of officers, Lieutenant. Those who follow orders precisely, and those who understand the spirit behind orders. You're the second kind. That makes you both invaluable and impossible." Fisher had no response. "I'm not documenting this incident," Sterling continued, "but understand, I can only protect you so many times before higher command notices. Eventually, your compassion will end your career." "I understand, sir." After she left, Sterling added her consultation letter to the file with the confiscated gifts. Evidence of a war being fought on terms that regulations couldn't quite capture. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 fundamentally shifted the war's trajectory. Allied forces advanced across France, liberating territory, driving German forces back toward their own borders. By autumn, victory was no longer a question, only its timing and cost. This shift affected POW camps in subtle but profound ways. German prisoners began to understand their country was losing. The propaganda that had sustained Nazi ideology, German military invincibility, the rightness of their cause, crumbled under the weight of undeniable defeat. At Camp Barkley, this manifested in a wave of ideological crisis among prisoners. Men who'd believed fervently in Hitler's vision confronted the reality that they'd sacrificed years of their lives for a losing cause. Some doubled down on Nazi beliefs, retreating into bitter denial. Others began questioning everything they'd been taught. Feldwebel Kessler was among those who changed. In a conversation with Colonel Sterling, recorded in camp reports, he spoke with stark honesty. "When we arrived here, we expected cruelty. Your propaganda told us we would be tortured, starved, humiliated. Instead, you gave us food, shelter, medical care. Your nurses saved Zimmerman's life twice. This made us more confused than any interrogation could." Sterling asked what he'd concluded from this treatment. "That perhaps we were wrong about everything," Kessler replied. "Not just the war, everything. What we believed about democracy, about other races, about human worth. You defeated our ideology more thoroughly with kindness than you could have with brutality. This conversation circulated through military intelligence channels. It confirmed what psychological warfare experts had theorized. Humane treatment of POWs was strategic brilliance, more effective at eroding enemy morale than any propaganda campaign. But Lieutenant Fisher never saw herself as conducting psychological warfare. She was simply being a nurse. In September 1944, she was finally transferred, not as punishment, but as promotion. The Army was establishing specialized medical facilities for returning American POWs who'd been held in German camps. Many of these men had suffered brutal treatment, torture, starvation. They needed not just medical care, but psychological rehabilitation. The Army wanted nurses who understood the intersection of physical healing and emotional recovery. Fisher's experience with German POWs, her ability to maintain humanity while navigating military regulations, made her ideal for this assignment. Her last day at Camp Barclay, Ernst Zimmermann requested permission to speak with her. He'd been transferred back to Texas after recovering in Michigan, part of an administrative consolidation of prisoner records. He stood in Sterling's office, still slightly favoring his left leg, and spoke in formal English that had improved dramatically over his months in America. "I wish to thank you, Lieutenant Fisher, for my life. Twice you saved me when you were not required to. I will remember this always." Fisher maintained professional distance, as regulations required. "I was doing my duty, Corporal." "No," Zimmermann said quietly. "You were doing more than duty. You were being human. In a war that tried to make us all inhuman, you refused. That is worth more than victory." After he left, Sterling handed Fisher a small wooden box. Inside was the music box the German prisoners had carved for her, the one that was supposed to have been destroyed. He'd kept it all these months. "Take it," Sterling said. "It's evidence that we're fighting this war for the right reasons, even when those reasons are complicated." Fisher accepted the box without speaking. Later, she would describe this moment as when she finally understood what she'd been part of. Not just medical care, but a quiet transformation of enemy soldiers into something closer to allies. Not through force or propaganda, but through the simple insistence that human dignity transcended warfare. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and millions of German POWs faced uncertain futures. Those held in America were gradually repatriated through 1946, returning to a homeland devastated by Allied bombing, divided by occupation, struggling to reconcile with the atrocities committed in their name. Ernst Zimmermann returned to Hamburg in December 1945. His family home had been destroyed in the firebombing raids. His mother and younger sister survived. His father had died on the Eastern Front. He found work as a mechanic, using skills learned in American POW camps to rebuild his shattered city. In 1946, he wrote a letter to the War Department requesting Lieutenant Fisher's address. He wanted to thank her properly, he explained, now that the war was over, and such communication was permitted. The request was denied for privacy reasons, but the letter itself was placed in Fisher's military file. She discovered it years later, when requesting her service records. The letter was brief, written in careful English. "Dear Lieutenant Fisher, I write to tell you I am alive because you chose humanity over regulation. In Germany now, we are learning what our government did, the camps, the murders, the evil we committed. Many of us are asking how we did not see this, how we believed the lies. I think of your kindness to me, and I understand that you saw me as human when I had been taught to see others as less. You could have let me die. Regulation permitted this. You saved me anyway. I am trying to be worthy of this second life you gave me. I do not know if I can ever repay such a debt. But I want you to know, one German soldier learned from you what it means to value all human life. Perhaps that is a small victory against the darkness. With deepest gratitude, Ernst Zimmermann." Lieutenant Margaret Fisher continued her nursing career through 1947, specializing in trauma recovery. She worked with American POWs returning from German camps, helping them process experiences that had broken them in ways physical medicine couldn't address. Many of these men had stories of brutality that made her work at Camp Barkley seem almost surreal. How could the same nation that operated death camps also produce soldiers who were grateful for American kindness? The answer, she came to understand, was that there was no single Germany, no monolithic enemy. There were individuals, some committed to evil, many swept up in ideology they didn't fully understand, others simply trying to survive war they hadn't chosen. Treating all German prisoners with humanity hadn't been politically neutral. It had been a form of warfare itself, psychological, cultural, ideological. By refusing to dehumanize the enemy even when regulations permitted it, American nurses had undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than any battlefield victory could. But that strategic success had come at a cost. Nurses like Fisher had carried the emotional burden of caring for men whose country had killed Americans.